Greetings, and thank you for joining Dr. Barber and myself for a book study on humanizing education for immigrant and refugee youth. I am Dr. Leah Panther. I'm an associate professor of literacy education at Mercer University, right down the road from Tucker. And I have been partnering with Tucker for just over 6 years now in supporting basically anything that teachers ask me to support. So with this book study, we're hoping to have some deeper conversations, strategies, and basically figuring out how can we better support the immigrant and refugee youth who are the predominant students, not only at Tucker High School, but whose numbers are increasing demographically within our community. So what does this work look like? So with that in mind, the first 24 pages of the book, the introduction and profile of the very first school are what we're going to be discussing during our first book study. So whether you just want a refresher or you don't have the time and capacity to read these books, so you're listening or watching this video instead, I can't wait to be in a conversation so we can go deeper around some of the ideas that I'm going to summarize for you here. So the book starts like most with the context. So what are we talking about and why? And they start with some statistics that 1 out of every 4 students in the United States is from an immigrant family, meaning either they themselves are immigrants, like 14.4% of the population nationally, or they are children of immigrants. So when you include children of immigrants in that statistic, now we're talking about 27% of the population of the United States. So let's see how that compares to Tucker. Tucker has just under 37,000 as of July 1st of last year. And of those, according to the most recent US Census, 16.5% were born outside of the United States, making our percentage just a little bit higher than the national average if we're thinking simply about immigrants broadly. However, if we start thinking about children of immigrants, again, that's a hard statistic to get at, but we know that over 20% of our households speak a language other than English at home. So at the very least, we know that Tucker, compared to the national average, has more racial, linguistic, and citizenship diversity compared to other cities throughout the state and throughout the country. If we think about Tucker High School, those numbers are even harder to pin down in a lot of ways. I know last year there was just under 1,700. I think that number is even smaller this year, but I'm not for certain. And how many of the students are either immigrants or children of immigrants? I don't know, but given that 70% of immigrants arrived prior to 2010 and about 20% of our population is under the age of 18, I'm guessing it's a pretty high number. It's probably higher than the national average. We could try to determine it based on who's receiving English language services, but that's not even foolproof because we know that you can immigrate from an English-speaking country, or you can be an immigrant and have proficiency in English. So those numbers aren't super helpful, though we do know about 23% of the population at Tucker High School is receiving some type of ELL services. So a lot. I mean, if I go just based on anecdotal knowledge, having been in a lot of classrooms, worked with groups of students, sometimes this is as many as 60 to 80% in a class that I'm sitting in. So we know the numbers are high, but we don't have an exact number. So all of that to say, the context that these authors are writing into is thinking about an increasingly racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse United States. And Tucker would be an example of one of those communities that is representative of that change demographically across America. And this can create a bit of a dilemma. And this dilemma is covered in pages 1 through 6 of the introduction that really thinks about the history that created this current moment. Now, this is not the highest moment of immigration to the United States. That happened in 1890, but we are in the second largest boom of immigration within the history of the United States. And we know that historically, immigration has not been open to all cultural groups. So we can say that this is the most diverse wave of immigration that we have seen within the United States history. We also know that refugee status, that's a relatively new concept. Fun fact, Jimmy Carter, our Georgia president, was the one who actually signed that into law. So it's been a fairly recent development that immigration could be something separate from forced migration through refugee status. Also, there's just such a broad range of reasons why people immigrate that it makes it difficult for folks to say, this is how you support immigrants and refugees, because it's not a homogeneous group. There's so many different cultural, racial, and linguistic groups who are moving by choice or by force for so many diverse reasons. And that also means we don't have a whole lot of longitudinal research that even says what works best for the group as a whole or those cultural subgroups, making it difficult to know for sure what the quote unquote best practices are, or even if there are such a thing as quote unquote best practices because of the diversity of needs within the immigrant and refugee communities. However, we do have a place we can go. On pages 7 through 9, the authors lay out that just as this idea of immigration is not necessarily new to America, even as it looks different right now, that there's always been resistance to supporting immigrant and refugee communities, whether that be denying them access to schooling or not adapting our pedagogical practices to better suit the needs of immigrant and refugee children. And in those time periods where there's been resistance and even a lack of integration of immigrant and refugee families, that community education has always stepped in to fill that gap. So we know that there are pedagogies that support these local communities of immigrant and refugee children that have existed throughout time, and we can learn from them. We can grow our own pedagogies by paying attention to what communities have historically done to support their own. So with that in mind, we know that there's opportunities to both acknowledge the history that led to this current moment and also grow our pedagogies by trying as best we can to learn from what works. And usually we learn those things by being in communication with local communities and families. So in order to set up this solution, the authors have a few key terms that they're going to refer to and use again and again throughout the book. And one of those is this idea of community cultural wealth. So if we want to learn from communities and families about how to best educate their immigrant and refugee youth, then we need to draw from their assets, their resources, their funds of knowledge, or what Yasso calls their community cultural wealth. And in Yasso's seminal study in 2005, she was able to dictate what some of those assets and resources that could be drawn from actually are aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, which includes both biological and non-biological kinfolk, social capital, navigational capital, resistant capital. Yes, even when students are resisting certain rules, there's a strength in that. There's some assets in there that can be drawn from and seen as strengths that help them navigate the world and schooling processes. So as we think about community cultural wealth, it gives us a lens to be able to see and name some of those assets that immigrant and refugee communities specifically have that they bring into the classroom with them. Jimenez went one step further and said, migration capital is actually its own unique source of wealth that we can draw from as well. And this is how Jimenez defines it. The knowledges, the sensibilities, sometimes we call it common sense, and we wish our students had more of it. So there's sensibilities and knowledges and skills that are cultivated through this experience of migration and immigration. It's very common for people to take like that gap year after high school and go travel the world, or the allure of this like mythology of backpacking through Europe. And then they come back and they're this completely new person. So that's kind of an exaggerated version. But that idea of when we travel, when we see more of the world, when we face different obstacles and hardships in that travel and in those experiences, we grow. And so there is something beautiful within that growth that can be drawn from as an asset, as a source of wealth that we can learn. And so our students that are coming through these migration and immigration experiences, whether it's in United States, through United States, in the borderlands, when we are equipped as educators to then see connect with, sustain, and expand on our students' lived experiences who have experienced immigration and migration. That is what creates our pedagogical spaces of possibility. And as educators, let's be honest, we've got practically scripted curriculums at this point. We have a list of 10 things we have to do during every lesson. We have lesson plans we have to turn in. There's a TEKS rubric that we're going to be evaluated on. There's an EOC that we're preparing students for. And not to mention all of the constant interruptions of these extra things that students have to do or our class has to accomplish that are beyond our control. The idea that there could be any space within our pedagogies, within our classrooms, to add something more, that seems pretty impossible. But that's hopefully what this book study is going to do. We're going to be looking through different strategies that help us to see, connect with, sustain, and expand on our students' lived experiences so we can see those spaces and really walk into that possibility to, again, draw from their migration capital. So that is the introduction to this book in a nutshell. There are opportunities to acknowledge the history that led to this moment and grow our pedagogies from what works. And we know what works comes from this acknowledgement of community cultural wealth. In particular, thinking about throughout the rest of this book, how we can draw from migrational capital to help better support your teaching of your discipline, the structure of your classroom within your current role as an educator, support staff, counselor, administrator. However, there is kind of one big question that lingers. What is it that we're preparing students for? And you probably remember in your teacher preparation programs, you debated all these different philosophies around what is the purpose of education? So if we're going to say that these strategies are all focused on helping students succeed, then we better have a clear common vision of what it means to succeed. So I'll leave the ball in your court for a moment. Maybe you can pause this and think about it. What would it mean for a student to be successful at Tucker High School? Okay, that was a long enough dramatic pause for me. But pause if you need longer. Maybe you were thinking about a grade point average, college acceptance, career, avoiding the discipline office, obedience, or finding something they're passionate about. The authors for this book are framing all 20 of their strategies around this definition of success. Students who are successful are able to form bonds with teachers and know when, where, why, and how to ask for help. They're able to, and so are teachers, able to draw upon language and culture as an asset for learning English. Here's the one that I think we probably all came up with. A successful student is going to be proficient in academic skills, but also life skills that are going to help facilitate that post-secondary transition, whether that be to college, to career. But they also extend this definition to say, but not only college or career in this country, but maybe their country of origin or somewhere else, having a more global mindset for what we're preparing students for. Fourth, success also means making sure that these learners are equipped with the skills, tools, and opportunities to deal with potential past or current trauma in ways that are congruent with their culture. And finally, that they have opportunities to cultivate and practice local and transnational civic engagement. Interesting. So are there any ways that this aligned with your definition of success, or maybe challenges or expands it? And I'll be honest, as an educator, I look at this list and think, in what world? In what world? I can barely have enough time and energy to get students towards that kind of academic skill side of things. How in the world am I, as someone who is untrained, going to provide culturally responsive and sustaining trauma-informed counseling for children in order to meet the criteria for number 4? How am I going to become a community organizer to meet the success criteria for number 5? That seems like a lot. So this is where I'm going to give you a sigh of relief. Notice it's 20 strategies to help immigrant and refugee students succeed. It doesn't say 20 strategies only to be done in your classroom in isolation that you are now responsible for, classroom teacher. No, this is holistic. This book looks at strategies that span from the classroom to the entire community. Everyone is taking responsibility here. So yes, some of the strategies that are in this book, like purposeful grouping, are best enacted at the classroom level. But then there's also larger scale, like PLC conversations, like how to best use advisory periods. And there's definitely a role for those who are outside of the classroom, such as instructional coaches. They have their own strategy section. Even things for our support staff who do things like community engagement. There's an entire strategy about how to best engage alumni. And there's definitely a lot there for our administrators to think about as well. If we're committed as a school to humanizing education for immigrant and refugee communities and youth, then that means changing the way we think about scheduling and staffing to make sure we're not just supporting the students, but also the adults who are supporting the students, because that takes a strain on us emotionally, physically, mentally. So then the chapter pivots in this introduction into looking at one of the schools that we're going to be learning these strategies from. And these schools are very diverse in that they're throughout geographically the United States. Some are private, public, charter. There's different demographics within them, but all of them have, like us, an above average population of immigrant and refugee youth. And what these schools do have in common is what they term the caring framework. And you can read the definitions of this on pages 14 through 16, but you can just look at them here. I know Tucker and DeKalb have their own acronyms to talk about what is most valued in the school, which, I mean, like H Pride, things like that, or even if you look at some of the principles of the MTSS or PBIS systems, those will give you clues about the mission and vision of the school, what is valued, even the mission and vision statements that are read on the announcements. So these are those core beliefs of these schools that are profiled throughout this book. And rather than telling us about the values, they actually show us these values in action by taking us into one such school. And in this particular school, on pages 19 through 22, they, for example, show how they have a 5-tiered ESL support system to scaffold students from kind of this isolated newcomers class all the way into mainstream, how they encourage the use of heritage languages while working towards this shared language so everyone can be in community together, how there are heritage language courses, and that there's partnerships strategically with the community to do things like have extended media center hours with free tutoring available for students, and over 30 after-school clubs that are hosted by community members. So you can see just in these 4 examples alone, the focus on working towards achievement through relationships, being compassionate by inviting community members in order to ensure that everyone is in an inclusive setting where they belong and are nurtured. And these have to be genuine relationships in order to have such well-sustained programs happening consistently within the school day and school year. But that's not all. They also have examples that go into how students and families have a voice in the school as well, such as students becoming cultural ambassadors to welcome new families and introduce them to the school, and professional learning for teachers on how to get documents and items translated to be able to communicate effectively with families. And they even invite parents to be a part of an emergent bilingual parent advisory committee to run these different policy changes by them and get them feedback in order to ensure that the school remains a caring school. So there's the telling us what these schools value, and then there's the profile that shows us what these schools value. So in the same way, it might be useful to think about, well, what does Tucker High School value? There's those things that it says it values, but perhaps it'd be even more helpful to think about, if I just observed an entire school year writing down everything that was done, what does Tucker High School show it values? And ultimately, whether it has funding or not, whether it has support staff to do it or not, what has Tucker routinely sustained over time? That even gives us a deeper picture of what the school values. So those would be some questions for you to consider and think about as you come prepared to have a conversation about the introduction to this book. Thinking about what are those migrational community sources of wealth that could be drawn from in your own classroom. And also thinking about what is it that Tucker most values. That way, as we read through each of these strategies, we can think about the migrational capital that's being valued and how we can translate it to your context. But we can also think about what about the school's values is aligned with Tucker High School's and therefore is most likely to be translated into something that we could take up and do to support our immigrant and refugee communities. I look forward to being in conversation with each of you as we launch into this book study.